So we are going to continue with our book talks, which I think Media Literacy Week book talks might become my favorite thing in the world. I am super excited for our next conversation with Bobbie Eisenstock for her book, News Literacy Now: How to Read the News. Bobbie is one of NAMLE's board members, and we're super excited to be able to talk through the book with her, but also, again, anyone that is in attendance will have the opportunity to win, will be entered in a raffle, and will have the opportunity to win this lovely book. And Bobbie is here with us now, and I'm so happy to see you.
Hello, Michelle.
Hello. Thank you for being here. This is fun.
Yes.
So I'm going to start, I think, with an easy one. Tell us why you wrote this book and why you wrote it now.
Well, there are so many reasons. Let me start at the beginning.
Please.
After the 2016 election and the overwhelming amount of false and misleading information that was circulating online, and it was causing confusion and uncertainty, and there were certain politicians who were accusing the press of being the enemy of the people. And they were calling out fake news because they didn't like what the news was saying about them, even though it was real news. I realized that teaching media literacy was not enough, that students need to learn not only media literacy, but they also need the knowledge about professional journalism standards and practices, about specific skills to fact check and to use digital tools to verify news stories. So they need to understand the nature of news. They need to understand the news gathering process, the distribution of news, and they need to understand how the journalism culture is changing. They need to dig deeper. As all of this was unfolding, the journalism department where I teach was re-envisioning our program for a digital world. And at a retreat, I raised my hand and I said, we need a news literacy class. And they said, great idea, go for it. So I started developing a class. I started the process of developing the course and the tedious paperwork that it takes to submit a new course to the administration and get it passed in your department. And they approved it. And that was 5 years ago.
Okay.
But I usually curate readings online. I don't use a textbook. I use online sources, so it's free to students. But when I was teaching this, and I teach it as a hybrid strategy, it is an intersection of news literacy, media literacy, information and web literacy. And I adapt a media literacy framework for it for journalism. So the book is a logical extension of that. But more importantly, it leads me to another reason, and that's my students. My students inspired me to write the book. They've grown up in this digital age of disinformation. Social media is the world that they know. Their daily experiences are lived in this technology. They get their news from social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram. And these are places where falsehoods spread faster and farther than factual news. And it's near impossible to correct the information once it's out in these public online spaces, because you remember what you heard first. So this social media landscape challenges them to know who and what to believe. And as they're coming of age to vote, and they're going to be our future leaders, they need to be informed. They need to figure out what's true and what's not true, and they need to be able to separate fact-based news from falsehoods and unverified opinions. And that's basically why I wrote the book.
Well, I'm glad you wrote the book. I usually would want to start with more content questions, but I do think I want to talk a little bit about the way you wrote it and the format that you wrote it in, because I think it's significant. One is, when I first read the book, what I found, you had this balance in it where I felt like I could send this book to my mom and she could read it and get the knowledge she needed, but I could also bring it into my syllabus. And that accessibility, I think you touched on it already, was important to you, but I think that's really significant. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the why of that, but then as you're talking, also the format. So you have these key takeaways in every chapter, you have these guiding questions, you have these prompts, and that makes it very, so you have this accessibility and also this action-oriented frame. So let's talk about the format. Why this format?
Well, thank you for saying that, because that is exactly what I wanted to achieve with the book. When I was writing the book, I wrote it with different people in mind. I would think about my friends. I would think about what I would want to tell my friends, what I would want to tell my family members, what I want to tell my students. I would think about what do they need to know. And even on the cover copy that I wrote, I said that the book is essential for everyone, whether it's a middle schooler, a high schooler, a higher ed, whether it's a teacher, an administrator, a parent or a grandparent, a media advocate, even someone who's an expert in media literacy. I wanted to engage everyone because it's critical that we all have this information. It's critical that we understand that the press is not the enemy of the people. It's critical that we understand the importance of the First Amendment and that the press is a watchdog role in as being the fourth estate. They're going to be a watchdog for abuses of power of the other branches of government and hold them accountable for us, for the public. It's critical that we have the skills to identify quality-based journalism standards and discern facts from falsehoods. And most importantly, it's critical that we recognize that just as the role of the press is to serve as a watchdog for wrongdoing on the public's behalf in a democracy, that we in turn have a responsibility to act as a watchdog of truth for ourselves wherever we get the news. So when I conceived the book, before I even started writing the book, I did not envision a typical textbook because I don't use typical textbooks. I wanted a question and answer format because it's not only reader friendly, but it reflects my approach to teaching and learning. I ask questions that engage my students in order to promote critical thinking. Also, the question and answer format is integral to the media literacy process because that's what we do in media literacy. We ask questions about the message, about the sender, about the receiver. Luckily, I found a publisher who saw my vision and supported it.
Yeah.
But the publisher also requested something. They wanted discussion, reflection questions at the end of the chapter. I wasn't going to put it there, but that's one thing that they wanted. So that led me to create the summary for the takeaways and create these guiding questions so that you could probe deeper into the intersection of media literacy, news literacy, and journalism.
Yeah, I think it's, I think what is, from the educator standpoint, of course, what is so great is being able to pull out, the sections or do a few chapters if you aren't able to dive into the entirety of the book. You make it very easy. It's very usable for educators. So let's talk about some of the content. And there's a couple of interesting things that I noticed. Obviously, I read a lot about this stuff. So there's certain things in here that I kind of, that stood out to me, like, oh, I'd never thought of it that way. And one of the things that you talk about news literacy is you talk about the development of actionable skepticism. So we've talked a lot about skepticism in the media literacy conversation, but I thought that was really, really interesting, this idea of actionable skepticism. Can you talk a little bit about bringing those two concepts together?
So in media literacy, we often differentiate between being a skeptic and being a cynic. A skeptic is someone who is thoughtful and questioning, while a cynic disbelieves everything. And in media literacy, we call it healthy skepticism, about questioning and challenging what we see, hear, and read in the media. In the news and information environment we live in today, critical consumption really requires actionable skepticism. So we need to take an active role to look for the evidence and verify the facts. We need to be able to determine whether the facts support or refute the information. And that requires skills to think like a journalist and to refute to think like a journalist and to search like a fact checker. The skills we're talking about are lateral reading, practicing click restraint, checking multiple sources, searching keywords, conducting a reverse image search, finding out who owns a website. All of this is actionable skepticism.
I don't know. I'm stealing that. Just a reference just so you know, I'll sign something if you need me to. The other thing that I was so glad that you did in the book was, we are talking so much about mis and disinformation these days. But you brought in malinformation into the conversation. And I personally don't think we talk about that enough. And it's super important for us to understand that type of false information. So can you talk a little bit about malinformation? Can you define it and share why you felt it was really important to bring, to not just focus on mis and dis?
So malinformation is another type of intentionally harmful information. It's doxing. It refers to publicly disclosing private information to deliberately inflict harm, whether it's on a person, a group, a company, an institution, even a country. And it's typically undertaken with malicious intent to embarrass someone, to bully, to harass, to get revenge, even to incite violence. And some of the personal information may be known online. You might be able to search for it, or the perpetrator knows something. They can figure this out. So it's important to understand because it's being used as a tactic today.
Yes.
Targeting elected officials, targeting judges, poll workers, religious groups, the LGBTQIA community, and many others. And we saw this play out actually on national television with those two poll workers from Georgia.
Yes.
Who were victims. They were falsely accused of election fraud by Trump and Giuliani. And they in their testimony, they said that they were harassed, they were threatened with physical harm, and they were doxxed. And now there's about a dozen states that have passed laws to protect election workers in order to shield their personal information. And it also increases penalties for physical harm and doxing. There's also last spring, there was a bipartisan congressional committee that introduced a Doxing Threat Assessment Act. And this was to prevent cyber harassment. And it would require the Department of Homeland Security to evaluate the risks that are posed on our national security as well as civilian privacy by the digital activities of terrorist organizations and other foreign bad actors. So I thought it was really important to put this into the book and to understand there's not only misinformation, but there's disinformation and malinformation.
Yeah. And I think I mistakenly said something about malinformation being false information, as opposed to how you framed it, which was a tactic. I think that's really, it's a weapon, right? It's when you use information against others. And I'm glad that you brought up the election officials, because, in our work that we've done with election officials, that particular story of the real life implications of disinformation on Americans specifically that are doing the work, how election false information literally impacted people's safety, right? Like that it's a really interesting thing to learn about, and also just a really good lesson for us to know about the consequence of this type of information. So a couple of other things. So I was recently asked to do a news segment, and it had a lot to do, with the coverage of Israel and Gaza. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation spreading, and I was asked to do a brief segment, and the question that the segment was addressing was, what responsibility do news organizations have to urgently distribute information, but also pause long enough to vet the information to make sure it's credible. So that I read that question and I thought, well, what responsibility do news organizations have? They have all the responsibility. Like they have to do this. Like this is going to be a short segment. Obviously, I stretched it out a bit, but I'm curious as to how you would answer that question. And from a news organization standpoint, or the way that we think about the reality of the timeliness next to the accuracy and how those things don't always mix.
Well, news organizations, their main responsibility is to get the story right. Getting the story right is more important than getting the story quickly. And that means that they need to verify the evidence. They need to be transparent about their news gathering process. They need to explain what they know, how they know it, and what more they need to find out about it. And in journalism, truth is provisional. It's called provisional truth. And that is the best obtainable evidence at the time. So as more evidence becomes available, the story might change. An example of this, and we have one this week, is the New York Times.
Yep.
The New York Times reporting about the explosion at the hospital
Yes.
in Gaza City last week. So the Times got the story wrong, and they weren't transparent in their reporting. They published a large headline, and in this headline, they indicated that the Israelis were at fault. And not only did they publish this large headline, but it became a news alert, and it quickly spread on social media. Then the Israeli intelligence disputed the claim. So the Times changed the headline, and what they essentially said was that Israel and Palestine were blaming themselves. And we're blaming each other.
Yes.
Yeah, they were blaming each other. Then what happened was the New York Times published a very rare extended editor's note, and they explained why they changed the headline. Yeah. They said that they relied too heavily on claims made by Hamas, and they didn't make clear that those claims were not immediately verified, that the story was still evolving. And it left readers with the wrong impression about what was known and the credibility of the information. They weren't transparent in their reporting.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting to see that both in my news feed, right? The original story and then the letter that they wrote.
There's an old newspaper adage, and it's, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And that means that journalists should never assume anything. Yeah. That even if the source is trusted like your mother, you should check it out.
It is such an impossible, I mean, one of the things I ended up talking about in this news segment was just the impossible, task of getting it right when even the consumers want the information fast, right? When we are in a system that relies on speed, right? And it's all speed and quantity. And you can't have that. And also you can't always have that and also have accuracy. Right. And that is business model. That is, it's a really tricky situation. I mean, it shouldn't be tricky, but I understand how journalists themselves are being asked to do the impossible in some ways, because they got to get information out there before they can do all the work of accurate.
But sometimes the verification process fails because they want to get a scoop. Yes, they want to be the first ones to beat out the competition. Right. And another reason why it can fail is because they have deadlines. They have to meet their deadline. Yes. But they have to be transparent in the way that they present the information.
Yeah, I think that is something that I don't know if the general public knows enough about, right? Is that the importance of the transparency, because you're not breaking news as often has inaccuracy, right? So it's like you have to be forthcoming in what you know at the moment that you're reporting it, right? And that things will change. But hopefully when everyone reads your book, they will know that for themselves. So tell me, okay, so this is what I've been thinking about a lot lately, and it's probably because we're starting to think we're a year away now of a presidential election, right? And it seemed in 2016 that the public was not prepared, right? So we weren't even talking about echo chambers or filter bubbles, and we were living in our own realities, and liberals were, their feed screamed, we're going to have our first female president, and the, Trump supporters were confident that he was going to win. And we didn't even know that I knew it, but people didn't know that social media gathers our data, all of this stuff. So it seems to me that there is progress that has been made, because even though things are getting, continue to get complicated, people are more aware, right? And that we're asking more questions, and that I notice that we're thinking deeply, more deeply about information. I notice it on my feeds, just people talking to each other in a different way about the information they're consuming. But clearly we have such a long way to go. And I'm wondering if you see that progress, and if you think we're on the right track, and kind of what you want to be seeing, especially as we enter this incredibly long, complex presidential election cycle.
This question is complicated. I do agree that the 2016 election made us more aware of our existing echo chambers and data privacy. It even increased awareness of media literacy.
Mm-hmm.
But being aware is progress because it can lead to action. But real progress is the action itself. So, for example, we may be more aware of media literacy, but that doesn't mean we are more media literate. We may be more aware of echo chambers and algorithms, but most of us are still turning to our echo chambers, and that exacerbates the media trust issue, which is linked to the news credibility issue. And that contributes to the rupturing of the political divide in our country. So consider something. Consider what recently was released in the Gallup poll about media trust. It is the first time that the number of Americans who express little or no trust in the media was higher than the number who expressed a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the media. And there was a partisan divide. 70% of Democrats said that they trust the media, compared with 14% of Republicans and 27% of independents. That's not progress.
Yeah.
If we made media literacy education a priority, that would be on the right track.
Yeah. I feel like there were so many pull quotes from what you just said, and I'm hoping that they're being tweeted out right now, because there was so much brilliance in that, and thinking about awareness of media literacy versus practicing being media literate. It's really like very, very good points. Tell me, so we don't have a ton of time. Tell me what your hopes are for this book and for the usage of this book.
Well, my main goal in writing the book was to help empower our news choices and the way we consume, create, and share information in the digital world. I hope that readers better understand how to read the news, and how to fact check, and that they pass along what they've learned. But ultimately, I hope that the book contributes to advancing media literacy as an essential life skill.
Me too. I hope that too. So what is next for you? So how do you take this book and do what's next for you?
My granddaughter's dance recital. She's 2. No, seriously. I dedicated the book to her. And
I know, I was going to say, it's so funny. The dedication is so sweet. Is it Isla Shea?
Isla Shea.
And the next generation, may you lead the way to a more caring, equitable, and media literate world. That's nice. That's so sweet.
Oh, well, thank you. But what's next is I'm developing a workshop to accompany the book.
Great.
And then in my spare time, I actually write animated books for Isla about her life experiences. She's already been to Ireland. She can count to 10. So I write these books and I animate it. So next just might be a book about news literacy, not for 2-year-olds, but for 10-year-olds, because we know that it's never too early to start media literacy education.
That's fantastic. That's so interesting to do it for the younger, like, not because I feel like this could be even middle school, high school, like you can really use some of this, but we need the younger grades. That's awesome.
Well, also when I started to write the book, I do a lot of workshops at schools. And
Mhm.
I went to my schools, to the teachers and the administrators, and I said, what would you want in this book? And the first thing they said was short.
Yeah, that's great. I thought you were going to say pictures, lots of pictures, please. Well,
No,
this is
so
awesome. I want to remind people your website where they can go to learn more about what you do. What is your website?
newsliteracynow.com.
Great. That's easy. newsliteracynow.com. And you can, where can you get the book?
You can get it from the publisher, Peter Lang. You can get it from Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can get it, from any bookstore.
Excellent. Excellent. Highly recommend. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for talking to us about it. And yeah, thank you for all you do namely for media literacy for the world. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay. Have
And
a good
thanks
Media
everyone for
Literacy Week.
coming. Yeah, happy Media Literacy Week. There's more coming later today. There's more coming tomorrow. We're like over halfway through, but there's a lot more content. Don't go anywhere.